Good morning, Year 9. I hope you're all well and I hope you're keeping safe and you've been enjoying the weather. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Edward the Confessor and look a bit more into the background of the Normans. Now, last week's task was based on the claimants, and I want to spend a bit more time looking at particularly Edward the Confessor and his relationship with William, Duke of Normandy. So just to start, before we do anything, I want you to think, what qualities and actions make a really good king? So I want you to draw a mind map, and I want you to say, what does make a good king? Write some ideas, and then please pause. And when you're ready to resume, we will go over what I think makes a good king. So please pause now. So if we look at what qualities there you need to be a good king. Now, realistically, you need to be a strong ruler. Okay, everybody needs to look up to you. You do not want people below you to think that you are weak, because therefore they have the potential to overthrow you. And therefore you also have to have a strong army behind you, because you obviously need to win battles, because there's a lot of threats, especially in Europe at this time. Now, at the same time, to be a king, you have to be a very wealthy person. So you do need to make sure that you have money. But ultimately, one thing, you want your succession to continue, and therefore you ultimately want a son. Now, unfortunately, ladies, sorry, they're not really interested in daughters at this point. It's a very sexist society. So every king really wants a son, because therefore when he dies it can move on, because if it's a daughter, often it would go to someone else, and that is the problem that happens in 1066. But at the same time, you have to remember, Anglo-Saxon England is deeply religious, is very Christian, so also you need to believe in God, otherwise you will upset people in such as the Holy Roman Empire, and like the Pope will be very upset if you don't follow Christianity. And realistically, although you have a strong army, you want to be able to keep the peace, okay? You don't want wars all the time, because wars are costly and it upsets people, because people lose out and obviously people die within wars. So you want to keep the peace as best you can. So when we're looking at the lesson today, what was England's relationship with Normandy? I really want to assess, how good do you think Edward the Confessor was? And I want to be able to explain to you what was the connection between England and Normandy, and to assess why Normandy was so important to the whole of Europe at this point, but obviously the relationship between Normandy and England. So, was Edward the Confessor a good king? I want you to have a think. Looking at this picture, what does it suggest about him? Does it suggest he's a good king? Does it suggest he's powerful? What I want you to do now is I want you to pause the video, and I just want you to write down, what is your first impression of what you see from looking at this picture? So please pause now. And what you can see from this picture is, it suggests that Edward the Confessor is very powerful, but it suggests that he's very, very religious. Okay, he's got the cloak gowned over them. He's got the crown, which suggests he's very, very wealthy, and it suggests that actually he's a very good king. Now, the Confessor part of his name, it means that he's actually very godly. Edward the Confessor spent much of the time praying, and actually one of the reasons why he probably didn't have a son is he spent more time praying, and really wasn't interested in ever getting married. Now, he did get married, okay, but his true relationship was dedicated to God. So I want to look at this in a bit more detail. Now, I'm going to give you a mind map, and your teachers, either Mr. Byrne or Mr. Bentley or myself, will send out you an information sheet. You need to open this information sheet now, and it should look something like this on this PowerPoint slide. So it should be in a Word document, and that is what you need to open. And what I want you to do is I want you to look through this mind map of Edward's reign. each has 2 bullet points, 2 interpretations about him. And both of the facts on the sheet are true, but both say completely different things about it. So what do we do? Now we have to use our instincts. Which do we think is the most important point to assess whether actually do we think Edward the Confessor is a good king? So if we do the first one together, religious. Edward was extremely religious and built Westminster Abbey. Now Westminster Abbey is still there today in London. But the second bullet point says he was too busy praying, okay? He was too busy praying. And that should say him being godly. So he was too busy praying and being godly to focus on any other issues. Now, you have to decide which one of them points is the most significant. Which one do we think is the most significant? Is it that he built Westminster Abbey, which has been around for about nearly 1,000 years, or that he was too busy praying and didn't get involved in the issues that were going on in the country? So have a think now and then go through. And then what you can do next is work through the rest of them. So you can look at the 2 bullet points on the leader and then the battles and whether he was fair and money, etc. Now, once you've done that, what I want you to do is I want you to come to an overall judgment. In which areas was Edward a good king? And which areas was he a bad king? Now, what you have to think, do you think that the good areas are more important or more significant than the bad ones? Now, there is no right answer to this. You can say that, yes, actually, I think the good points outweigh the bad points. Or actually, no, I think the bad points outweigh the good points. Because we want to assess with our learning objective at the top how good of a king Edward was. So what I want you to do after you've weighed up the evidence, I want you to then write a paragraph explaining how far Edward was a good king. Now you need to do this by balancing. So in history, we obviously throughout year 7, 8 and now 9, we balance our arguments. We give one side the argument and then we give another side the argument to counterweight. Now what I've given you below is some sentence starters, but I want to just give you an example of what I suggest by this. So before we start, I'd like you to look at this example. And it says, Edward was not a good king because when it came to looking strong, for most of his reign, he let Godwin and the son Harold run the country. It was almost like he let the Godwin family be kings instead of him. And this is something a strong leader would never do. Now, remember at the start of the lesson, I said that one of the key things to be a good king was to be a strong leader. So the first paragraph is the negative point. And then, however, I've swapped it. On the other hand, he did fight Godwin to try and take back power, and he forced Godwin to apologise. However, he then let Godwin and his son take over again straight away. So he's a weak king. So really, what I've done in this paragraph is I've done a counterbalance that I've said he wasn't a very good king, okay? And then I've said actually he was a good king. How then I've done another counterpoint to say ultimately though, he allowed his sons to take over straight away. Again, so ultimately he is a weak king. So what you need to do now is you need to look at the evidence and try not to copy the one that I've just done. And I want you to write your paragraph for your teachers because this is something that you need to submit to us, okay? Counterbalancing how good you think he is. Now, please pause this video now because this might take you 10 minutes or so to do. And then when you're ready to continue again, please press play and we will continue with the lesson. Now, if we look at Edward the Confessor and we look at his relationship with Normandy, you have to understand the background of Normandy and how it kind of existed. So I want you to look at this map and I want you to look at what can you learn about the Vikings. So we're talking about the Vikings' influence before 1066. And please, and I will move my face because it's in the way, so into the sea. Moving to the Atlantic, I want you to look at this column down here where it says the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century. And what does this suggest about the Scandinavian settlements? So have a think now and pause. What is it suggesting about in the 8th century where we look up here and where the Scandinavian influence and the Vikings originated from, what does it suggest about how they moved across Europe? So have a think, and then we will go for the answer. So, if you've paused and have a think, and you may be struggling, or maybe some of you are actually thinking, yeah, I think I know the influence, what you can see is that the Scandinavian influence and the Vikings generally travelled throughout Europe during this period and over the course of hundreds of years. Now, what you can see is they originated and started in Norway and Sweden and slowly moved into the 9th century into different areas. So they moved into Scandinavia further up, but they also moved to the north of England. And you get a lot of influence within the split within Anglo-Saxon society and the northern parts of England. And there was lots of wars that went over to create actually England as a whole. And as you slowly see, moving towards the 10th century, they move east and then obviously moved up to Iceland as well. And then in the 11th century, they move slowly north a bit further. But the green represents places where they'd often have raids. Okay, now generally, you only call a Viking when they are raiding places, but they don't really have any settlement, okay, along this part of the coast of Europe. And if we can see, Normandy is here. But this is the connection with the Viking influence and the Normans. So how did Vikings gain control of Normandy, and who is responsible? So I want you to have a look. Okay, have a look at this suite and try and work out what type of person or what the person was called that was responsible for gaining this bit of land. So pause, have a think, and then I'll tell you the answer. So the Viking leader that gained influence in the place called Normandy was Rollo. Now, what I want you to do, the next task, is I want you to watch the video that has been sent to you on Teams about the history of the Normans. So please click off this PowerPoint for now and click on the link sent to you by your teachers, either myself, Mr. Bentley or Mr. Byrne. Click on that, and then once you finish watching, come back to the lesson. So after you've watched the lesson, the video, and it's given you a bit of information, that should not say 1911. That is a bad mistake by me. Bad mistake. 1011, we should say 1911. We're looking at World War I time period. 1011, Rollo attacked northern France. Okay, and although he was unsuccessful, the French king, and he was called Charles the Simple, says a lot in his name, realized that he was unable to drive out Rollo, and he didn't want them to keep raiding and killing people, taking their crops, okay, and looking for treasure. So he proposed a truce. He said, if you stop raiding our lands, okay, then I will give you an area of land called Northern France. And Rollo renamed his land Normandy. And it was taken from the Scandinavian word Normandy, meaning northernman. So the reason why that area of France is called Normandy is because the Vikings had come from north and they were associated as the Northmen. Now, I'm going to read to you next because we've got a bit of background of what happened. I'm going to read to you some information about how William, the Conqueror, not the Conqueror at this time, William, Duke of Normandy, I should say, and how his relationship with Edward allows him to eventually take the throne. And as I read this story, what I want you to do is create a storyboard based on the information I'm going to go over. You need to add pictures and writing in your own words, so make sure you listen carefully. If you think I'm going too fast, you can pause, you can rewind, and go over it again. I want you to create a good storyboard to help you explain to yourself what is going on and what is the relationship between Edward and William, Duke of Normandy. I'm going to move my face before I start down here. So, Edward. Edward the Confessor was a very religious man, but he wasn't very, very rich. And therefore, he was supported by a family called the Godwins. And they were the richest family of men in the whole of England. So they basically funded Edward the Confessor. Now, this gave him a lot of influence. And actually, there was so much influence that Edward the Confessor married one of the Godwins, Edith. Now, Edward, I should say, and Godwin, they basically had a falling out. And Edward basically outlawed them. He banished the Godwins. So the Godwins, Harold Godwinson's father, was banished, and Harold Godwinson was banished himself. Edward was venerable, it says. It is not venerable, it is vulnerable. So I'm going to edit that. Edward was vulnerable and looked to support from the Normans. Now, remember, he's made an enemy at this point. He's outlawed the people that have supported him through many years. So he needs to get support from somewhere else. And he looks to support from William. And basically, Edward gives the Normans positions in his own government. And this gives them a lot of influence. And it was argued that in return, during this period, Edward promised William the throne. So Edward said, you support me, you help me, and when I die, you can have the throne. Now, this influence of a foreigner, in a sense, upset many Anglo-Saxons. And in 1052, Godwin and his son, Harold Godwinson, managed to gather a large amount of forces against the king. And they basically pressured the king. Give us back our lands, or we're going to remove you. And ultimately, Edward was forced to restore their lands. And because he was forced to restore their lands, the other issue was that they wanted the Normans banished from England. So the Normans were banished from England. But Edward still did have a good relationship with the Normans. And this is where it gets a bit complicated. The Normans stated that Edward, because of his good relationship, because he had that good relationship over the years, forced Harold Godwinson in 1064 to go to Normandy and swear an oath to William that he should be the next king. Now, this was disputed by Harold Godwinson, but this was what's written in the Norman Chronicles. Now, unfortunately, Edward apparently swore to Harold Godwinson on his deathbed that he should be the next king. And this is where you have the issue of two people now being promised the throne. One had been sworn the throne previously, and one had been sworn the throne on his deathbed. And this is ultimately going to lead to the Battle of Hastings, because Harold Godwinson is crowned king, and William feels very betrayed by this. So what you need to do is you need to go over that information again, and you need to now make your storyboard. Hopefully I've explained it, but if you have any issues with this understanding, reread it again first before you email myself, Mr. Bentley, or Mr. Byrne. Then ultimately, what you've looked at here is England's relationship with Normandy. And hopefully this lesson's given you a bit of background to actually assess whether Edward the Confessor was a good king or not, how there was a connection between Normandy and England, and how Normandy came about in the first place, and really why it was so important. So hopefully that's all makes sense. And if you have any issues, as I said, please email your history teacher and they will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.